doing their job. The story changes, doesn't it? The story drives how we feel about things, how we understand things. Have you ever been a person who's on the highway, and because you go to a good church, that guy keeps talking about little things like just obey the speed limit because it's a way to worship God? Romans 13 says it. So if you're breaking the laws, you're slapping God in the face. So then there you are driving down the highway, worshiping God, trusting that he's going to manage your schedule, go on the speed limit like God says to. And then you see two cars, zoom, zoom, pass by you. How many of you hate to watch the people racing 95, 100 miles an hour down the highway doing who knows what? But what if those two cars are white with lights on the top? And it's got these great words on the side that says, police serve and protect. How many of you like to see police racing to the job to save the day? Our stories drive how we understand things. And if our stories are right, we're going to end up in the right place. If our stories are wrong, we're going to end up in a wrong place. Everybody tracking? Joseph of the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I'm not old enough to know that reference, actually. How many of you are old enough to know about Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat? All right, there we go. Okay, everybody with gray hair except for Ginny knows that one. So Joseph, poor guy, he got a bad deal. His dad had 12 sons, and so Joseph is one of these sons, and he was the favorite son. So his dad, in a time when dyes were very expensive, he made this very special coat so that everybody would know that out of all his kids, Joseph is the favorite. Now there's a 12th kid, Benjamin. He's kind of too young and all that stuff to really kind of know what's going on. So we're just going to set him aside. Still like him. That's Benjamin. My big brother's actually named Benjamin. It's kind of a cool thing. Son of my right hand. But he had 10 brothers who didn't like that Joseph was the favorite. So it was a bad thing that Dad gave Joseph this coat, so that way everybody would know for sure, Joseph was the favorite. And if Joseph's the favorite, the other 10 are not. So Joseph is at the house, and he's just hanging out, and he's supposed to go hang out with go see on the brothers. And the other 10 brothers, they're out in the fields working. They don't have a shiny coat. They don't have pretty colors. They're working. So Joseph, who isn't really working, goes to check on the brothers. When the brothers see that pretty little rainbow coat come along, those 10 brothers, they decide the best thing to do would be throw him in a hole, take that pretty little coat, tear it up, put some blood on it, and go back to Dad and say, gosh, Dad, looks like you picked the wrong kid because he got torn up. And all we have is this pretty little coat. That blood must be his. This is before DNA testing, so they would just assume, yep, that's blood. Besides, if all 10 of your kids agree, must be the case. They got a tight story. Until they see some of their distant cousins. I'm talking like 19th cousins. They're wandering around, and they are slave traders, and they're going down to who knows where and who cares where. And they go, we could just let him starve and dehydrate to death in the bottom of this big hole that we threw him in, a dry cistern. We could just let him die there. But, hey, who could always use a little bit of money? Raise your hand if you could always use a little bit more money, right? Let's sell our brother. Let's sell him as a slave, like a forever slave. We're not just like renting him out. We're not just saying, oh yeah, he's the kid brother. We'll let him, shovel the snow off your driveway for the morning. Sell him into slavery forever. So they pull him up, sell him into slavery. Now Joseph had a whole lot of reason to be mad at those 10 brothers, because now, instead of a prince in his own land, he's not even in his own land, and he's nothing like a prince. He is a slave. And all the fault for all of this is those 10 brothers. And he's a slave, so he can't even go back and punch them or slap them or yell at them or tell on them and tattle on all of them to mom and dad. He had plenty of reason to be mad at those 10 brothers. So he ends up not even in his homeland, not even nearby. He ends up in Egypt. Egypt, if you ever look at a map on Google Maps or something like that, there's a whole lot of green on one tiny little line that goes through Egypt. The rest is brown because on the count of three, Egypt is covered in 1, 2, 3. And that is hot and it is dry. It's worse than a St. Louis summer all year round. They don't even like St. Louis. They don't even like St. Louis, unlike St. Louis, they can't even use their, can you believe how cold it is complaints? He can only use his, can you believe how hot it is complaints? How terrible is that? And he's a slave. So he ends up in Potiphar's house. This is the head of the bodyguard of the Pharaoh who walks around and says, yes, I'm a god. You may worship me. Yes, I'm a god. You may worship me. Hey, you over there. I'm a god. You may worship me. He's a slave in the bodyguard of that guy. And it's all the fault of those 10 brothers. He doesn't have a way to text them, to call them, to write letters to them. He has no way to work it out and say, hey, what gives? Did you know how bad it is? Can you at least come down and buy me out or, bring me food? No way to communicate. So all that tension is just building up. So why is he in Egypt? Those 10 brothers. Why is he a slave in Potiphar's house? Those 10 brothers. But those are the cards he's been dealt. So Joseph, and this is all in the book of Genesis. So Joseph just keeps his head down, does the job, is faithful to God, has high integrity, and he's kind of handsome. So Potiphar's wife decides that she's going to take special interest in him, which made everything way more complicated because he either avoids it and gets in trouble or leans into it, has fun, and then gets in trouble. And he wouldn't be in this situation if it weren't for those 10 brothers. But now he's here. So he decides to do the faithful, the righteous thing, and he says he's not going to have anything to do with it. She gets mad, and he goes to prison. Now, he could blame Potiphar for not asking questions. He could blame Potiphar for not picking a better wife. He could blame Potiphar for not even trying to figure out what really happened. He could blame Potiphar's wife for putting him in a bad situation. But you know who really is at blame? Those who? 10 brothers. Now he's in prison. Now, I would not want to be in prison now. Doesn't sound like a good place. A lot of great movies come out of these things. Doesn't sound fun. Back then, oftentimes in prison, you had to provide your own food or you go hungry. Back then, you did not have a separate bathroom from your cell, which means the people who were in your cell before you also did not have a separate bathroom for their cell, so they went where they were. And now you're sleeping on that dirt floor. And how likely do you think it is that they turned over the soil from time to time? They didn't care. Now, he could be mad at Potiphar. He could be mad at his 19th cousins who had dragged him into slavery. He could have been even mad at his mom and dad for playing favoritism. But you know who he would really have time to blame? Those 10 brothers. So then he bumps into a couple of people as he's there, and he decides to be faithful, and he ends up running the prison. So he bumps into two people. One is a guy who used to be a baker for the king. Another one was the cupbearer for the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And so they have dreams. Joseph hears it. He interprets their dreams, but he says, promise me this. When these dreams come true, you won't forget me. Now, the dream for the baker wasn't good. He dies. But the dream for the cupbearer was great. And now that guy, when he gets reinstated after 3 days, he has Pharaoh's ear because he's the one who sips the cup before he hands it to Pharaoh to make sure it's not poisoned. I would not want that job, but that's a great high trusting position for Pharaoh. So this guy has the ear of the most powerful person that had ever lived up until that point. And what does that guy do? He made a promise that he would not forget Joseph in prison, but that guy forgets. And it's like 1.5 years. Until finally Pharaoh has a dream. And then the cupbearer remembers, oh yeah, Pharaoh, I know who can interpret your dream. Way back when, this guy helped me out with the dream. Now, I mean, if you want me, I'll go and call him. But that would be like me doing that for you. And so then finally, when the cupbearer can get something out of Joseph, he remembers Joseph. So Joseph had to spend extra time in prison Now, he could be mad at the warden that it wasn't nicer. He could be mad at Potiphar. He could be mad at Potiphar's wife. He could be mad at the cupbearer for not remembering and leaving Joseph in prison for something that he didn't even do. He could be mad at the Egyptian justice system. He could be mad at his 19th cousins who brought him into slavery. But do you remember who he had every reason to be mad at? Who was that? Say it the fun way. Those 10 brothers. So then Pharaoh takes notice. And he goes, all right, come on in. Let's hear if you know the dream. So he tells them the dream wonderfully well. And the Pharaoh goes, you know what? You got the job. You're going to be the one managing all of our food systems and all this stuff. And just don't mess it up. So now he's in charge of virtually all of Egypt. At a time where if you're in charge of a lot and you mess up, they just kill you. So Joseph is not the favorite of his dad. His life every day is on the line. And people would have been mad at him. He would have had the stress of running an entire empire at a time when you didn't have instant communication and you couldn't watch the news to know what's really going on truthfully and accurately. So this life is on the line constantly. The amount of stress when he could have just been at home, being like a prince in his own kingdom, shepherds and sheep and all this regular stuff, and he would be completely fine, completely protected, completely safe. So every time somebody came in and said, I didn't get proper wages from my blah, 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 Joseph had to deal with that stress and keep riots from happening and all sorts of chaos happening. And he could have blamed Pharaoh for not doing the king job. He could have blamed Potiphar. He could have blamed Potiphar's wife. He could have blamed the other servants who had already been taken advantage of by Potiphar's wife that didn't testify. He could have blamed the Egyptian justice system. He could have blamed his 19 cousins who brought him in there. He could have blamed the cupbearer. He had so many people to blame. But you know how grudges feel. And you know who Joseph had every right to blame, the ones who started all of it off, and the people that he had every right to ask for years of pain to be reinstated to him, for them to be hung from the walls of Cairo or wherever the capital city was in those times for thieves. He had every right to expose them in their viciousness to their dad. He had every right to ask for every drop of blood for all the pain that they had. He had every right to blame. Who? Those 10 brothers. So they show up. Hey, we're all hungry. We need food. And Joseph recognizes them. And then they recognize him. And what does Joseph say? I invite you to take a peek at the Bible with me. That's what happens all before Genesis 45. I bolded it because I wanted you to be able to see this. Joseph has a different story. And that story makes all the difference. Not just for him, but for us as we're dealing with our stuff as well. Take a peek. Verse 5. We bolded it. Here's his story. I invite you to read that bolded part with me. Verse 5. God sent me before you to preserve life. Is that good? That's not the story that you and I probably would have rehearsed for 20, 23 years. You and I probably would have rehearsed a story. I can't wait to get back at them. They stole my livelihood. They stole my safety. They stole like 23 years with my dad. They stole the opportunity for me to know my kid brother because, different wives and moms, it was a mess. They stole my opportunity to just wake up in the morning and drink a cup of coffee, know that daddy was going to take care of stuff, and that one day when I'm older, daddy would pass, and then I would ease into the role of transition. They stole a virtually stress-free life from me. But his story, verse 5, one more time. God sent me before you to. So he got to be a life saver, preserver, protector, provider. Wow. Because it was not the hands of his 10 brothers. It was not the hand of those 10 brothers. It was the hand of God. Then take a peek at verse 7. I invite you to read that chunk with me in verse 7. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you. Do you see that for you? Man, what is wrong with this guy? That's not the story at all. The story is they were jealous. The story is they would rather him suffer for the rest of his earthly life as a slave and never again wear pretty colors, to put him at the hands of the mercy of strangers rather than deal with him having his feet under the same table at dinner. That's not the real story, but that's the story Joseph figured out over time. And then last time, verse 8, I invite you to read that chunk with me in verse 8. It was not you who sent me here, but so who sent him to Egypt? Not those 10 brothers. All that stuff happened because of God, to do good for Joseph, through Joseph. The story changes everything. The story that we tell ourselves, the stories that we rehearse changes everything. How we respond, how we think, how we process, how we recover, how we deal with that person again. The story changes everything. And the bigger story is God is always at work. The bigger story is always God is always at work to do good. I am not just telling you this as a person who just has a Bible and just read some great commentaries. I'm a person who lives in this world, just like you, just like Joseph, who has also suffered unimaginable, horrible things. Now, I'm not saying that my chaos is as bad as yours or worse than yours, but we live in this world, and this world is nasty. It is mean. It is traumatizing. It is painful, but it's also still fully under God's protection, watch, and work. And if we have time to unpack things that we have endured, we would start to see that God was forming us, transforming us, drawing us closer, and preparing us for whatever else we had to do. I want to pick a neutral example. I've got some other examples, but I don't want to traumatize people with rehearsing some past pain. But how many of you found school less than fun? We learn math, not so you can figure out tangents and cosines, but so that way you can think through complicated problems by making it easy. We have to write all those persuasive papers so that way we can actually recognize what makes sense and what doesn't. We had to go to gym so that way you can actually be healthy and active as you get older. So many things we hated. So many things we hated that God was using to prepare us for life. Not just for our traumas, but for the traumas that other people are going to go through so that we could help them because we've been there before. So as we bring all this together, the traumas that you have faced, were there people like Judah and Issachar and Naphtali, those 10 brothers, were there people like those 10 brothers in your story? Yeah. But what good was God at work doing? If there's something horribly traumatic, don't go to that right now. We can obviously work through that, you and I together at some point. But the other stuff, if you could let that go, because you see the real story that God was at work, it makes it a lot easier to forgive. The stories matter. One story is that you are just here bumping along, hoping that it doesn't blow up in your face and that you get through it okay. It's just you and your canoe with a paddle. But a real story, the real story, that includes our feelings, is that God absolutely adores you and still wants to include you and still cares deeply for you and is still actively at work for you. And that's the only story that makes sense why God himself would come all the way down from heaven and deal with us, interact with us, teach us, heal us, restore us, inspire us, go to the cross for us, come back from the dead for us. And as 1 Corinthians 15 said, which you read very well, Rob, come back from the dead for us as a guarantee that he'll bring us back from the dead. See, he doesn't want to just deal with us for the 20 years or 90 years or 3 days that we're on this planet. He wants to be around us forever. So he went to the cross. He came back from the grave to reset the score, to forgive us. See, if we're pains in the neck, God wouldn't forgive us, but cares about you. And if he cares about you, he cares about everything that has happened in your life all along the way. And if there's stuff that doesn't make sense, if there's stuff that you're angry about, if there's a grudge that you can't forgive, I would suggest there's a bigger story at work. There's a bigger story at work. That the hand of God was doing something that you don't and I don't quite understand. The very end. When I went to the seminary, I found that almost all the pastors that were also going to the seminary, I don't know if things have changed, but almost all the pastors that I went to seminary with, there were two kinds. Two kinds, very few exceptions, two kinds. One, ruthlessly bullied. Or two, their dad was a pastor and they thought, that's an easy job, I'm going to do that too. My dad was not a pastor. One day, I was working at a grocery store in the express lane. And I met this guy who's this tall. See, he hadn't grown since the 6th grade. And suffice it to say, his name was Adam. I had to check his ID for something that he was purchasing. It was cigarettes. And he pulls out his ID, and I see that name. I knew his face because he hadn't changed since the 6th grade. I changed since I was in the 6th grade. I started lifting weights. By that time, I'd already had a few years of martial arts under my training. But he was still a 6th grade little boy. And I realized I could tell him who I am and let him know that I've got 10 years of anger to pour into his face in the parking lot because I will be off in 2 hours. But then I saw that he was a Marine. I still could have taken him. But in that moment, I was thankful. I was thankful that whatever trauma made him my bully was done. That our country was reforming and reshaping him. The stories we tell drive us. There may be a grudge you're holding on to. Maybe there's a story you're not seeing. I guarantee you there's a story you're not seeing. And when we see that God has been involved all along the way to prepare us for something bigger, it makes it easier to forgive. I'm asking a lot out of one sermon. So I'm just sowing a seed. What if what you're angriest about isn't really them, but it's us, not yet seeing the hand of God? If you need any help processing any of your stories, any of your things, I am at your service. But until then, here is your moment with God.